Hello, I'm Rabbi Mark Gelman.
And I'm Father Tom Hartman.
And we welcome you joyously back to our series on our Muslim neighbors. We've been talking about one of the strong connections between the three Abrahamic faiths. That's how we refer to them, because all the three faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam connect in the figure of Abraham. And so we thought it would be a wonderful idea to talk about prophets and the connection between Islam and Judaism and Christianity and the prophets that we learn about in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament. And we've talked about Abraham and Moses, and on this show we're going to talk a little bit about Noah, but a lot about Jesus and the Muslim attitude toward Jesus. And with us is our friend Alex Kronemer, a documentary filmmaker, a frequent writer and lecturer on Islamic awareness. And also joining us today is our friend Sohaib Sultan. Welcome, Sohaib, who is also our colleague in writing a Dummies book. We wrote Religion for Dummies, and Sohaib just finished the Quran for Dummies. And, you know, it's really hard to explain to your friends that you wrote a book for dummies. You either have to admit that you're dumb or they're dumb. They needed a better title for that series, but it's very successful. And anyway, he's currently pursuing his master's in Islamic studies and chaplaincy at an extraordinary place, the Hartford Cemetery. Yeah, right, that's what we called it when I was in school. The Hartford Seminary in Connecticut. So welcome, Sohaib. Welcome, Alex.
What led you to study religious studies?
Well, specifically at Hartford Seminary, they have a strong program for Muslim-Christian relations. And I felt that, especially in our situation in North America, we need a program where religious communities are coming together and understanding one another and working with one another for good purposes. And I thought that studying at the seminary would be a perfect way to do so. And also, the seminary has a very strong tradition of Islamic studies within the context of the American Muslim community, which is still in the developing stages. So it's been very interesting studying that and developing theories.
Mark and I are very committed to this common theme, common thread, common humanity. And it comes easy for us, but not for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
In your experience in terms of the seminarians, people who are studying the Islamic faith, is there a desire to be more inclusive or more exclusive?
Well, certainly at Hartford Seminary, there's a culture of deep inclusiveness. So I can't speak about seminaries in general, but Hartford Seminary is an institute that believes in multi-faith representation, multi-faith culture within the American context. And so, and even within the global context, because they go abroad, like to India and other countries, and also explore interfaith relations there.
We've been looking at the prophets. Tell us something about Noah from an Islamic point of view.
Well, in the Quran, Prophet Noah is said to have lived 950 years, just like the Bible says. And his story basically revolves around the notion that he persevered in bringing the message of God's oneness and submission to God to his people, while he was being persecuted, rejected, and mocked by his people. So Noah's story is of great courage and great perseverance in the Quran.
Yeah, in Judaism, Noah's a figure, not a particularly important figure, because Noah isn't a prophet. I mean, he's a figure of importance because he was a righteous man. God saved him when God decided to flood the world. And there's an interesting rabbinic interpretation of Noah. It says in the Bible that Noah was a righteous man in his generation. And the rabbis say the lesson here is that he was righteous in his generation. But there were many generations where he wouldn't have even been considered righteous at all, which teaches us that our job is to be the best of the generation you get, not the best of any generation that ever lived.
I think in Christianity, Noah is considered a big figure because kids love the story of the ark and the animals, and did two of each one get on the boat, and they were saved in the end. But our interpretation when we were going through the seminary was that God said, while I may punish humanity, I will not obliterate humanity. And so that there'd be two of each so that the creation could continue.
There's another element of Noah. I wonder if it occurs in Islam. For us, the covenant with Noah is, of course, the covenant where God says, I will not destroy the world again. And the rainbow is the sign of that covenant. The second important element of Noah for our tradition is that Noah is our link to Islam and to Christianity and to Hinduism and to every other faith. Because our doctrine, which is also, as I understand it, the doctrine of Islam, Christianity has a little different take on it, is in my understanding, and you need to correct me if I'm wrong, Tommy, is that our idea is that the righteous of all people go to heaven, go to the Olam Haba, the world to come. Every righteous, and our teaching is that God revealed certain laws to Noah. You know, don't eat living animals, don't murder, different things. Basic morality. And if you follow the 7 Noahite laws, you go to heaven, whatever your faith. Is that similar? You don't need to accept any. It's not just Jews who go to heaven. It's anyone who's righteous. Does that come from Noah, and do you have a similar idea?
Well, in the Quran, you don't find this narrative about Noah. Noah's narrative in the Quran is really interesting in that it seems to be constantly a story that seeks to strengthen the hearts of the believers and of Prophet Muhammad, and saying that if you feel like you're being rejected and being mocked
look at Noah.
and being persecuted, think about Noah, who lived 950 years and went through all that and still persevered.
Alex, what's your
So
take
that's
on
what
Noah?
is his context.
Well, I mean, I think to the point that you were raising in terms of, obviously there's differences of opinion, but the majority opinion has always been similar to the Judeo idea.
That all righteous people get there.
That Jews are judged as Jews, and Christians as Christians, and Muslims as Muslims, and by their righteousness. The Islamic idea is it's really a measure of your good and bad deeds, your righteous acts and your sinful acts, that determine which direction
You don't have to be a Muslim to get to heaven.
No.
Right. Well, one interesting thing that I think is important to explain is that from the Quranic narrative, the term Muslim means one who submits to the will of God.
Right.
And so we believe that all the prophets were Muslim in that concept.
Yes,
and that all
It's
people
Muslims-
who followed them are Muslims.
In essence, it's Muslim small m. Sometimes we talk about, in the Quranic context,
Small m Muslims.
Islam and Muslims, we're thinking about the religion as we know, but
Right.
what it's actually being referred to is the righteous people who are submitting to the will of God. They are the Muslims, not Muslims that we understand as a religion, but Muslims as a certain behavior.
And the Christian view about the righteous of all nations?
Well, it's expressed in 2 ways. Some will say you need to affirm Jesus as your Messiah to be saved. And others will say that if you affirm that fact indirectly, namely by the goodness of your life, you would be saved. The second interpretation is from Matthew, in which he says at the end time the Son of Man will gather and have everyone before him and say, some to the right, some to the left. I was hungry and you fed me. And the people will say, well, when did we see you hungry? They didn't even know they were doing it for God.
Right.
As long as you did it to the least of my brethren, you did it for me.
Yeah. There's a very strong tradition of that in Islamic literature as well.
That's beautiful.
It's beautiful.
How about the figure then of Jesus? We're going to get to that. When we return, we'll continue our discussion with another important figure in history, one of my favorites, Jesus. So stay with us on Our Muslim Neighbors.
Welcome back. We're talking about the Muslim attitude toward Noah and to Jesus, and we're getting on now to the question of Jesus. We're learning about the notion of prophecy in Islam, and with us is our friend Alexander Kronemer, who produced the documentary Muhammad, Legacy of the Prophet, an extraordinary work, and Sohaib Sultan, the author of Quran for Dummies. So, let's talk about Jesus here. It's always good here. They like it. I like it. Tell us what is the what's the Islamic view of Jesus? Tell us the Islamic view of Jesus.
Well, Jesus as a figure in Islamic thinking has a really unique role or a unique post. He's considered a man who was sinless. He, like the Christian belief, he was born of a virgin. He raised people from the dead. He performed miracles, and he was ascended directly into heaven, and will return as the second coming on Judgment Day. So there's a lot of great similarities. Where Muslims differ with the Christian concept of Jesus is primarily over the notion of whether or not he was divine. Muslims believe that Jesus was a man, a prophet like Muhammad, like Moses, etc., and that salvation can't come through believing or through praying through, to him, but again comes through good deeds versus bad deeds, which Jesus is seen as an exemplary model of good deeds. He's the guide in his behavior for how we should behave.
Right. And in the Quran, Jesus is called Ruhullah, or the Spirit of God. And the Spirit of God, overwhelmingly in the scripture, is one of mercy. And so the entire story, the entire narrative, the entire life of Prophet Jesus is one of mercy.
Right. And you probably know that, when Muslims refer to Muhammad, they always will append peace and blessings be upon him.
Right.
They do the very same thing for Jesus.
And
With
for
his
all the
na-
prophets.
And for
all
Moses,
prophets,
sure,
yes.
yeah.
Peace and blessings be upon him.
Right. We have that as a general reference to all people who have passed. We say, may peace be upon them. Or, so it's really a reference to all those we love and who we revere. What is the objection? Because Judaism shares the Islamic objection to the notion of God becoming man. That is the fundamental objection to the notion.
Yeah, you once told me that in Judaism you can't understand how God could ever become human, that it's a contradiction in terms.
Right.
And I said to you that the way I was brought up, what I believe in, is that God so loved the world that he sent himself. And of course in the Trinity, God the Father creates the world, God the Son is Jesus, who redeems the world, and God the Holy Spirit sanctifies the world.
Yes, that great mystery of Christian belief is one that, still remains outside my understanding because of its depth for you and its mystery. It's a great mystery, the notion of how one God can become many gods. That was an initial debate among the rabbis. I wonder if it happens in Islam. The question of the Trinity was dealt with by the rabbis to the question of, well, are Christians idolaters? Because your Shahada and our Shema both affirm there's one God.
Right.
And you affirm one God, but it's one God, a triune God, as they say, a three-part God.
Right.
Is that an issue for us? And the rabbis conclude Christians are not idolaters, that even though we cannot understand the Trinity the way Christians understand it, it is a belief in a single God.
Well, in the Quran, and you should probably comment on this too, but in the Quran, there is sort of this idea, on the one hand, of saying the Trinity is not true. There's a unity. Jesus was only a man. But at the same time, still affirming that Christians need to be respected, that there's something about the theological, the Christian path that is a path that can take you in the right direction, even though this is considered by Muslims to be a mistake.
Well, I don't understand one thing. How could you affirm in Islam that Jesus was born of a virgin birth and still believe that he was just a man?
Well, actually the Quran addresses that by saying that people who believe that the miracle of Jesus was so great that he must be divine, the Quran says, well, what about Adam? He was born neither of a mother or a father.
Right.
So by that logic, Adam should be divine.
Uh-huh.
But in reality, all God has to say is be, and it is. And that's what the Quran says, that's the miracle of God, that he says be, and it is.
In your services, do you ever quote Jesus? Do you ever tell stories from the Bible?
Yes, sometimes we do. In fact, there's a lot of sayings about of Jesus in the Islamic tradition. And there's a book by Khalidi. He writes about the Muslim Jesus.
The Muslim Jesus, yes.
Yeah, and he has a lot of sayings that you find in the Islamic tradition of Jesus.
Yeah,
It's a fascinating book.
What would be some of the connections or the sayings of Jesus in the...
Well, if you look at those sayings, they're mainly about the compassion and mercy of Jesus, overwhelmingly. And
Now,
his spirit comes through in that.
In Judaism, you have the Ten Commandments. In Christianity, you have the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the peacemakers.
Well, you have
have
the Ten
anything-
Commandments, too,
We have the Ten Commandments
and the
also.
Beatitudes.
Right. Is there any teaching like that in the Islamic faith?
Well, Muslims believe, and the Quran teaches all the commandments except for the one about keeping the Sabbath holy, which we believe is only for the Jews. But other than that, the Quran agrees with each of those commandments, and it does talk about Moses receiving these commandments. But it doesn't order them, it doesn't list them in that order, but talks about them in various chapters of the Quran, about its morality.
Jesus tended to be pacifistic, if you could describe it. Your enemy strikes you on the one cheek, offer the other cheek as well. How would you describe Muhammad?
Well, yeah, that's a very interesting point. You know, it strikes me sometimes when I've studied Muhammad and thought about him a long time that there's two phases to his life. The first phase, when he was in Mecca, is a very, if you want to say, Jesus-like phase. I mean, it was a phase when he was being attacked, his followers were being killed, and he was always saying, turn the other cheek, have patience, forbear. It was only when, like Moses in a way, later in the Medina phase, when he had the duties of state, when he had to begin to make laws, when he had to put out judgments and punishments and defend against attackers, that we have the Muhammad that sometimes, you know, we feel uncomfortable with, you know, the person who takes out a sword and the person who fights battles and so forth. But that early phase, which was the most significant phase in terms of spirituality of Islam, was a phase very much in keeping with that.
See, when I think of a prophet, I think of somebody who connects you to God, and somebody who is spiritual, prayerful, reflective, and not an activist.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible that Muhammad had different phases of his life where he was a prophet at one point, but he was a governmental leader at another point?
I wouldn't say
No,
that. That
no,
would be a wise idea.
See, I
That
think,
would be an idea, probably a bad idea for you.
Well, that's
see,
true.
I think what you have to look at is that Prophet Muhammad, just like Prophet Moses and David, Solomon, all these people, they were leaders of a community. And when you have a community, you have the responsibility to defend it. And therefore, he had to take on this warrior role at certain points in his life.
Right, and let's not forget that the Christianity of Jesus is not the Christianity of the Catholic Church, in the sense that the Crusades were not exactly a pacifist enterprise. And, you know, whatever Jesus was personally, and I agree completely with you, my understanding is the same as yours, that Jesus was basically a pacifist. But that the Church, when it took on the bureaucratic demands of protecting Catholic power, said, okay, we're going to go and kill the infidels and the Moors and reconquer the Holy Land. And they didn't do that by pacifist means.
Well, Muhammad's career was overwhelmingly pacifist, too. I mean, he had a 23-year period where he was a prophet, where he preached. And if you added up all the days that he was either on his way to battle or engaged in battle, they amount to several weeks, 4 or 5 weeks of actually fighting. The rest of these 23 years was spent in a much more pacifist mode. But of course, we tend to think of the battles as
it led to the Islamic Empire, which was not put together by
not in Muhammad's lifetime.
No, not in. But it led right to
So,
it.
you studied in other parts of the world. What's the reaction to the prophets in the Muslim community in other parts of the world?
In other parts of the world. Well, I studied mainly in Saudi Arabia with some scholars. And in the Islamic tradition, the Quran itself says that you must not make any differences between the prophets, that you must respect them all. In fact, in the Muslim creed, if you say that I believe Moses or Jesus is not a prophet, you cease to be a Muslim. That's part of the Muslim creed. So wherever you go in the world, you'll find Muslims respecting and loving all the prophets and always saying peace be upon them after they mention them.
We spoke in the last show, just touched on differences between Sunni and Shia in terms of the authoritative interpreters of Islamic law and the differences between the two Muslim traditions. You studied in Saudi Arabia, and there's a great deal of discussion about Wahhabism, and the rather, at least it is described, the more extreme form of interpreting Islam. Is there a difference in the attitude toward the prophets in Wahhabism as opposed to Sunni and the Shia mainline traditions?
No, I didn't find any myself. I mean, you have to, respect all the prophets according to the scripture. So then that's a point of unity for whether you're Shia, Sunni, Wahhabi, or whatever you have.
Does it lead, look, respecting the prophets is a very important thing and powerful, but does it lead to respecting the other people? Do you think someone could respect?
No, that's a point of departure because Wahhabis, for example, or other similar ideologies, maybe they'll say that we respect all the prophets, but that their original teachings have been distorted by their followers, and therefore we don't respect their followers today.
Thank you, Sahib, for giving us your wisdom. When we return, we'll get a chance to learn how the stories of these prophets are taught to Muslim children today. So stay with us on Our Muslim Neighbors.
we have joining us now Laura Maqsood, a member of the Education Committee at the Islamic Center of Long Island, and the mother of two. Welcome, Laura. Laura, you're on the Education Committee, and you supervise and are aware of all of the educational offerings at the center. Tell us about how the prophets are taught to the children.
Well, the prophets are taught starting at 4-year-old preschool, and basically the teachers just try to bring in the stories that are in the Quran about the prophets and how they surpassed any controversies that came to them in their life, and how they, had strength and believed in God and wisdom.
That's really good.
What did they say about Noah?
Well, Noah, that story is always very fun with the animals coming onto the ark, and it's the same story that's in the Christian tradition about the flood and how Noah had to stand up and bring his message to the people.
How about Jesus? What did they say about Jesus?
The story of Jesus, actually, having a Christian background, I was very happy when I became Muslim that I didn't have to turn my back on the story of Jesus. The story of Jesus is basically the same except for the divinity of Christ. That he was born of the virgin birth, and actually he was able to speak from childhood, which is always fun for kids to know that when he was in the cradle, he was speaking. I think that's pretty...
So was I. That's one of
and
the...
you haven't
So was my
stopped.
That's the only similarity between me and Jesus. But one of the issues that we're talking about is this ability or inability to connect the prophets to the traditions that come from the prophets. Does the love and respect for the prophets, for let's say Jesus in the Quran, lead in your teaching at the center to love of Christians? And does the respect for Moses lead to love and respect for Jews?
Well, we would hope so. That's what our mission is, to make sure
So you
that,
make that connection.
Yes.
It isn't just Moses or Abraham or Noah or Jesus. It's the people who came from them.
Right. For myself personally, I see it as a historical outgrowth. Like, Islam just was an historical outgrowth. That's where we had to go. With the story of the prophets, that's where we had to go.
And do you feel that message that just as we love Moses, we should love Jews?
Yes.
Just as we love Jesus, we should love Christians?
All the prophets are loved the same.
Do you feel that connection between the prophets
and their
the people, right,
Yes.
are made?
That's what we at ICLI do.
Yeah, and that's Quranic. I mean, to be a Muslim,
Right.
you have to, I don't know if the word's love, but you have to respect and protect
Right.
Christians and Jews. That's part of the duty of being a Muslim. That's part of what you'll be judged on Judgment Day, of how well you performed in that duty as a Muslim.
Alex, what have you taught the children about the prophets?
Well, the prophets are a great way for not only children, but for all of us, really, to understand ourselves and understand our spiritual journey. The divine is such a huge thing. The journey is so hard. And these people stand as examples that we can say, boy, what Noah went through is a lot what I'm experiencing, or what Abraham, or whatever. It helps us with guidance and gives us strength.
Tom, I think these are really important points, and I've learned a lot in the show. That I think Muslims really have the right take on this, that prophets are examples for the struggles in our own life. And I think they also teach us that each of us can connect to God, but they also teach us that some people connect to God on a level that's far beyond anything we'll ever know.
I've enjoyed the show because I felt very comfortable with the idea that we're all talking about holy people. We're all talking about the same God. We're all talking about it as, what can I learn from you, rather than how can I fight you? Mm-hmm. And that's what our Muslim neighbors are all about. If we could learn a little bit more about each other, have each other as friends, I think the world would be a better place. I'm Father Tom Hartman.
And I'm Rabbi Mark Gelman. God bless you.